So, one of the reasons why we debate, one of the purposes, is for clash. You all know what that means? Clash? It's when I say one thing and you respond and say another. Debate, by its nature, is about clash. It's about two different perspectives, okay, about a problem area. So the affirmative has this perspective over here, the negative has this perspective over here, all about the same problem, okay? So what is fundamental to debate, what is crucial and key to debate, is being able to respond to that other perspective. And that's what refutation means. It means to overthrow one's argument. Literally from the Latin, that's what it means, to overthrow. It's a sort of a military kind of a concept. We're friendly here. But the idea is still similar. It's still roughly similar. So if I advance my perspective towards this problem area, then the other side needs to also advance and answer what my perspective is. Because if all I do is stand up and say, GMOs are good, GMOs are good, GMOs are good, and this person over here says, no, they're not, here are some reasons why they're not, and oh, by the way, banning GMOs is going to cause a problem with China. But GMOs are good, GMOs are good. See, what has happened there is I'm advancing my perspective, but I am not answering their arguments at all, right? That's what refutation is all about. It's about talking about our arguments, but also answering their arguments, okay? So in your workbook, your sheet here, on page 11, under the second Roman numeral, you'll notice the 5 stages of refutation. So refutation is a process. It is something that we do, and once we refute once, that doesn't mean we're finished. We're not finished until the timer goes off, right? And just because I refute something doesn't mean that my partner should not also answer it, unless we're talking about the negative block. So it's a process, and so there are 5 stages. Each one of these stages are extremely important. The first is obviously you have to listen carefully. And with that, that means you also need to write it down, okay? Which is why we talked about flowing and note-taking. So focus your listening. I used to teach my debaters back home that they needed to get in the moment. Now, none of them knew anything about Zen, Buddhism, but to focus and exclude and silence all of the extraneous external noise, to shut out the world and only focus on a particular item is what we're talking about. You may be hungry, forget about it. It may be hot in this room, forget about it. Or it may be cold, forget about it. Jake might sneeze, forget about it. All of these distractions you need to eliminate from your mind. And you focus all of your attention on these arguments. Okay? So that's stage 1. Focus. Be with the arguments. All right? Now, the second stage is relatively obvious. That is that you need to talk about, or briefly mention, what the argument is. So, for example, here, if I'm responding specifically to the B subpoint of this advantage, I would want to say that. I'd want to say, now, to answer the affirmative's B subpoint of the advantage, I'll have a couple of arguments. First, GMOs don't use many chemicals. GMOs, pesticide data is flawed, okay? So I would specifically refer to that. Why would I do that? Why would I specifically announce what the particular argument is that I will refute. All right, think of who your audience is. Judges, exactly. Very good. So if the judges don't know what it is you're talking about, then you can't win the debate, right? So I could stand up and say, GMO's good, GMO's good, GMO's good all day long, but if the judge doesn't understand why my particular arguments for why GMOs are good apply to the specific argument, then they may misunderstand. Okay? This is also a skill that will be useful for you in your everyday life. If you ever find yourself in a relationship with someone and you get into an argument with them, it's important to say, well, you know, when you said blah, 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 I want to talk about that. Because then you can minimize the miscommunication. All right? You can try to eliminate that. All right. So that's the second stage, all right, is state what argument it is you will be refuting. The third stage is to extend your argument. Extend your argument. Extend your perspective, okay? I could say GMO's good, GMO's good, GMOs are good, and I need to do that, okay? Because I need to win my perspective. Yesterday, Jake and Shanna talked about how we need, when we are debating, we need to win our case. Right? Because if you can't win your case, you can't win the overall debate. So you have to extend your arguments. You have to reinforce your arguments. You have to build on your arguments. And you have to remind the judge why your arguments are important, which I'll get to in a minute. Okay, so extend your arguments. The fourth stage is you need to obviously answer your opponent's argument. Okay? So they said something that nuclear power is good because it's inexpensive. Well, then you need to be able to respond to that. Not only do you want to say that nuclear power is bad and it'll cause a lot of problems, but you also need to answer why is it not inexpensive. Cleanup costs, for example, very costly, right? So there's always another way of looking at these problems. So you have to answer their arguments. So while we are extending our perspective, we also need to crush or lessen the force of their perspective, okay? You see what that does? If we had scales, it would be like this. So you advance your perspective and you also lower theirs, which makes it easier for you in your 2NR or 2AR to explain to the judge why you should win the debate. Okay? Which is actually the fifth stage. And that is always, always, always explain the impact. Explain why this matters. Ask yourself the question, so what? Who cares? If pesticide data is flawed, so what? Who cares? Well, Jake explained why. It means you can't trust the affirmative. That's why that's an important argument. Okay? So he's refuting this B subpoint. And when he gets to the fifth stage of that refutation, he says, pesticide data is flawed, which means, so what? Who cares? It means you can't trust the affirmative's claims. Okay? Does that make sense? All right. Any questions? This is actually a process that should come relatively naturally to you. Because you've all been in discussions and arguments before. So the question really is, how do we do it in an effective way in a contest, like debate? Okay? Now, how about this? what if my opponent says something that I am not really all that prepared to answer? What if, for example, Jake were to say, sumo wrestling is the best sport on the planet? I don't know anything about sumo wrestling. How do I answer that? Well, the first thing I will say is, no, it's not. No, it's not. I might also say, well, talking about which sport is better, baseball or sumo wrestling, is really a question of preference, right? There's no objective way of determining which sport is better. All right. So I might think of that. I might try to think of other examples. Well, talk about the sports that I do know and maybe why they're good. Or I might say, well, you know what? Sumo wrestling is not only not the best sport on the planet, it may actually be the worst sport on the planet. After all, it encourages people to be fat, right? That's not healthy. Chinley's like, yes. I mean, there might be skinny sumo wrestlers. I don't know. But the point is, I can use what's under Roman numeral 3 here in your packet. These are specific generic tactics that you can use in any situation, regardless of the topic. I know nothing about space exploration, yet I could debate somebody on it just by using these tactics. So you can deny the argument or deny that something exists, or claim, which is the first one, right? Denial. So just say that they're wrong, they're incorrect. Maybe they don't have their information correct, or maybe their information is old, or maybe they haven't experienced every sport in the world. So if Jake is claiming that sumo wrestling is the best sport in the world, well, Jake, have you ever experienced cricket? So how can you say that sumo wrestling is better than cricket if you don't even know anything about cricket, right? So you can use denial. You can mitigate. That's the B sub point, mitigate, which means to lessen, okay, to lessen. So if someone were to say, nuclear power is really, really dangerous, I could say, because I am not a nuclear physicist, I don't know much about nuclear power plants. But I do know that there are nuclear power plants all over the world, and some of them must have some safety checks on them. Maybe we can't predict everything, okay? But for the most part, maybe they are safe. I mean, after all, we have oil ships crash into the ocean, right? You can't predict that every time. So nothing is ever 100% certain. But I do know that those safety checks do exist, which means that when my opponent says that nuclear power is really, really bad, I can mitigate. When they talk about harms and when they talk about impacts, that's where you use the mitigation refutation tactic. That's when you say it's not really all that bad, okay? So then the next one is the opposite of that, right? And that's to maximize. So when would you maximize your argument? Remember, it's when you are extending your arguments, you are advancing and extending your perspective. You want to make it as big and as important as possible. Okay? So if the opponent says GMOs are harmful, okay, and over here I have a disadvantage that says no, banning GMOs will hurt Abe's, actually help Abe's chances of winning the re-election, then I want to make that a big deal. I want to emphasize that. Emphasize the arguments that you know can win for you. So you may not know a whole lot of information about a particular topic, like space exploration or sumo wrestling, but whatever you do know, you want to really highlight and emphasize that. And every single one of you, when you're engaged or when you are doing these debates, you want to sound passionate about it. You want to sound like the judge believes you. All right? And we're going to talk more about that later today. The DISA point is alternate causes. Alternate causes. Debate is not only about clash, but it's also largely about X causes Y, cause-effect types of arguments, right? Here, the affirmative says GMOs are bad. Why? That's maybe a cause, and they're harmful because they hurt ecosystems, which is Y. GMOs cause Y, hurting ecosystems. A disadvantage works similarly, okay? The plan happens, that's X, and it causes Y, which is really bad. All right? So X versus Y. The problem with cause and effect arguments is that there are usually multiple causes, or causes that you can't account for, that maybe you don't know about. We know they exist, but we may not know, we may not have enough information to really make a determination. GMOs is like that. Lots of studies have been done about GMOs, but we are still relatively unsure about if they're good or bad, okay? Which means that there are other things in the process of GMOs that we just don't know yet. So which means that the affirmative will have a difficult time proving their harms, which is a, what? What is harms? If I'm the negative and I beat you on the harms, what does that mean? Remember that we talked about blame, ill, cure, and cost. Okay, so ill is the same thing as a harm. And what do we call those? Solvency is another type, but they are stock issues. Stock issues. And if I'm affirmative and I cannot win my harms, I can't win the debate, because it's also part of my burden of proof. Right? If there's no harm, then who cares? Right? Why should anyone vote for the plan if there's nothing, if there are no problems happening? So this is why I know that we've talked a lot about specific debate words, but think about how all of this, if you put it all together, how it works. Right? The affirmative has to meet its burden of proof, which are a specific set of things that they have to do. Right? They have to prove there's a problem. They have to prove that there's a cause to the problem. They have to prove that they can solve the problem. And they have to prove that they can accrue or gain some sort of advantage. Right? And the negative has to respond to that and has to try to win that one of those stock issues doesn't happen. All right? But this is why understanding alternate causes is very, very helpful, because it was yesterday, it was Yaya, wasn't it, Jake or Shanna, that was looking at a piece of evidence,
Yeah,
and you said, there's a bunch of causes here the affirmative can't solve for. And that is an excellent debate technique. All right? So, again, because debate is about cause and effect, trying to find alternate causes to whatever the problem is can be a very useful refutation tactic for you.
You kind of mentioned this is where those analytical arguments we were talking about is based on.
Yeah, and remember when he said that you don't always have to read a piece of evidence? This is one of those moments. Okay, you may not have a piece of evidence from an expert saying that, Japanese aquatic ecosystems are in trouble because of not only GMOs, but also because of other pesticides or chemical spill-offs, because of pig farming, because of Fukushima, because of invasive species from China, okay? You may not have a piece of evidence that says all of that, but you can still make those arguments, right? Because Japan's water ecosystems have a variety of different problems associated with them, okay? As do most water ecosystems around the world. So GMOs are not the only cause. All right? And then finally, turn the argument. ESA point, turn the argument. What do you think that means? It's using their argument, and if they say something is good, you find a way to say that it's bad. If they say that something is bad, then you try to find a way to say that it's good. So if Jake says sumo wrestling is the best sport on the planet, I can easily say, no, it's not the best sport on the planet. In fact, it might be really bad. So he's going from something that's really good, and I'm turning that to say, no, it's actually bad. So these are what we call turn arguments. Aristotle actually talked about this, 2,500 years ago, where we can turn our opponent's argument against them. So if this were the soft power advantage and not the marine ecosystem advantage, and they said, oh, well, if we ban GMOs, we will raise Japan's prestige, we will raise their respect around the world, okay? And then I run as the negative the Abe disad, which says ultimately, if Abe gets his way, it would be really bad. We'll probably get into some sort of conflict with China and South Korea. What am I really doing? I'm not only saying that the plan causes something bad, but I'm also saying that increasing Japan's prestige is not only not good, it's actually a real problem, because if Japan does that, if Abe gets his way and he's able to flex his muscles, then that could invite aggression and hostility from Korea and China. Okay? So in that sense, we have multiple kinds of arguments occurring in a debate, but one can turn the other. Something that's much more direct would just be a basic one, like if someone says GMOs decrease water quality, okay, for the affirmative. The negative could say, no, they don't. GMOs actually improve water quality. Okay, that's a real basic kind of a turn argument. All right? So that's refutation. That's refutation. Now I am going to pick on someone real fast. How about you, Mr. Gap? What's your name? Shota. Shota. Okay, so Shota, I want you to think about the refutation process, okay? And I am going to say that, let's see, I want to make the argument that global warming is in climate change is not a problem. It's not a problem because, the reason why I know it's not a problem is that we had one of the worst winters in the United States this past winter. And so if it's really cold in the winter, how can the Earth be warming, right? So that's my argument, that global warming is not happening because we had a really cold winter. Now, refute that. Yes, absolutely. Yes, it may have been a little cold in the winter, but it's really hot in the summer. Okay, excellent. All right. So you would state the argument. Say, my opponent says that cold winters mean there's no global warming, and you'd say, I disagree with that because Dr. Zampetti is crazy. And the reason why I disagree with that is because they're really hot summers. And the only thing that's left is to, which is hard in this kind of an exercise, is to explain why that's a big deal. What's the impact? Answering that so what question, okay? Which you want to do in a debate round. But for us, just kind of having a conversation, you don't always have to do that, okay? But you do need to answer the how or the why. So if he says, no, actually, I think global warming is happening, I'm going to ask, well, why do you think that? So he needs a reason, okay? So he needs a reason. And that's refutation.